大家好，我其实是在上海出生的，但是刚才将军讲常年在澳大利亚的墨尔本，所以我的职业生涯全部都是在澳洲，所以用英文讲，那大家请多包涵，就当训练听力了，好吧？Okay, adaptable human. What I'm going to talk about is taking the company and your career to the next level. What does that mean? First of all, I'll show you this picture. Anyone recognize who these people are? Anyone? Yes, Christian Bale. And if you don't know, all these three people, Christian Bale. That's one person. And he's actually known in the Hollywood to be a very adaptable actor. And he will actually do whatever to actually get into the character for the movie and for the character. So he's very adaptable. And I think we can be adaptable too. So we can have a successful career as well. Well, Zhang Jun's mentioned who I am a little bit, so I'll sort of make this brief. 7 years ago, I came here to give a talk. At the time, I was a team lead. I was still being hands-on and doing a lot of Ruby work. I was contributing to Rails quite a bit, so my talk was, fairly technical. 7 years later, I'm getting older. Not sure about whether I'm any wiser, but I'm certainly getting older. So this talk's non-technical. So as I mentioned before, I grew up in Shanghai. I spent my childhood in Shanghai, in Jing'anchu is where I grew up. And then halfway through my, high school, I moved to Melbourne. It's a beautiful city. I encourage you to come and visit. The air quality is very clean. So that kind of gives me a bit of a unique perspective because I think I still hold a lot of the traditional kind of Eastern values, but because I've spent about 20 years in Melbourne, a lot of how I think and how I see things becomes more Western. So I guess I'm kind of stuck in between the two cultures. And hopefully that will give me a bit of advantage. So just a brief history of my career, I suppose. It's a very slimmed down version. I've worked at about 15 different companies. I started off doing PHP shortly after I graduated from high school. When I was doing uni, I've got freelancing gig. I was doing part-time. And then in 2008, I started my full-time career as a PHP developer working at a digital agency. And very shortly, I joined this company called Envato. I'm not sure whether anyone's heard of it. They're based in Melbourne. They're a global company. They selling digital assets and tutorials like Photoshop, coding, so on and so forth. This is the first job where I started off as a PHP developer, and then I transitioned into Ruby. And ever since then, I started loving Ruby more and more. Fast forward a couple of years, around 2012, I got my first leadership role at SidePoint. I took a huge pay cut to get the job. And again, it was a PHP shop. I wasn't doing any Ruby stuff, but I got to lead a team, and I got to lead the technology as well. And then a year later, I joined Locomo. That's where I kind of worked when I came here in 2012 to give the talk. At the time, I was leading a team. I built and architected 2 products. The company had 3 products at the time. And it's an interesting journey because I've been at Locomo for about 2.5 years. Shortly after I gave my conference talk, I went back. And because it was a startup, very fast-paced, we need to get a lot of things done very quickly, I got burnt out twice. And towards the end of it, I suffered depression. So the very next day, after I realized I got the depression, I resigned. And I joined REA Group, which is a pretty large multinational corporation, also based in Melbourne. They've got a few thousand people. In the grand scheme of things, maybe not that big compared to the Alibaba or Baidu here, but in Melbourne, it's considered one of the largest companies. And the interesting thing about REA, and we do real estate, so property and some things like that. Because the real estate industry in Australia was booming, so what happened was that we've got the huge needs for developers. We don't get enough developers in Melbourne or in Australia, so we ventured out. So we partnered with ThoughtWorks in Xi'an, and we hired a team of 100 people in Xi'an to specifically work on the real estate product for us. And funnily enough, that's how I met one of the speakers later this afternoon, Zhi Chao. He was one of our best. So he was working at ThoughtWorks before. And then sort of fast forward a couple of years, I was a CTO at eCal, which is a very small company. We've got a team in Melbourne, got a team in Philippines. And then for the past 2 years or so, I worked at the company called Explore. We are a startup / scale-up. We build childcare software. And as Jiangjun mentioned before, I kind of defected from doing Ruby stuff, and I'm now doing Elixir. So I put up this slide just so that I can feel more relevant, because this is not a technical talk. However, once upon a time, I built some libraries. So as you can see, I've got some Ruby libraries, some Elixir libraries. I built a machine learning library using naive Bayes. I built a web scraper, and then I built a queuing library for the web scraper as well. That was maybe a year and a half ago, I did that. And again, just to let myself feel relevant, around 2013-14, I was quite active in the Rails community. So I took this screenshot a couple of nights ago. Apparently, I'm still ranked at 214. It's not bad. However, these days, this is my world. My day-to-day looks more like this now. Spreadsheets, metrics, keeping track of various different projects. That's what I do. All right, so enough about myself. Let's begin the talk, and I want to start with talking about the philosophy, because I think everything leads back to philosophy. First of all, shapes. Now, there are many, many different shapes, different colors in the world, right? Everyone's different. Every individual is different. Every company is different. Have you wondered? Now, excuse this slide, and because once I arrived in Shanghai, I just realized I can't use Google anymore. So just imagine this is Baidu, and you put in Chinese, right? 完美的原型存不存在? Try to ask Baidu this question and see what you get back. The next concept is chaos theory. You may or may not have heard of chaos theory, but I think most of us probably have heard of butterfly effect, 蝴蝶效应. Butterfly effect is part of chaos theory. What it describes is that every micro decision you make on a daily basis, on a second basis, will have a profound impact to your future. So every decision counts. I'm going to split my talk into two main parts. The first part, I'm going to focus on the organization level. And the second part, I'm going to focus on the individual level. So let's start from organization level. Have you guys seen this? No one? Really? Okay. So this comic's a few years old. However, what it describes is largely how those multinational companies work. So at the top left, you've got Amazon, which is more of a traditional company structure, top down, right? You have Google, once upon a time, they had a CEO and then 2 co-founders, so everyone talked to each other. They're more collaborative compared to Amazon's organization structure. Facebook is more flat structured. Everyone talks to everyone. Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO, he doesn't have an office. He sits with everyone else. And then this is the old Microsoft. The Windows department shoots, the Office department shoots, the Azure departments, nothing gets done. Hence, that was the old Microsoft. And then we have Apple, very obviously. This is Steve Jobs, the red dot, and he talks to everyone. Sometimes he'll reach into the teams as well. And then Oracle, it's not really a tech company. Is anyone from Oracle? I apologize, but it's the reputation is more like a legal and sales company. I remember in Melbourne, Oracle's got an office, and one of the companies I worked at before, we share the same building. Every time we enter a lift, we see people in suits, right? They're all from Oracle. All right, talking about companies, Nintendo. Because I'm going to talk about what an adaptable organization looks like, and Nintendo is one of the best examples I can find. Now, Nintendo as a company has been around for 130 years. It was founded back in 1889, I believe. The interesting thing about Nintendo is that we know Nintendo as a video gaming company, right? But they didn't start out doing video games. They started out by selling playing cards, poker cards, poker pie. And then they actually ventured out to other industries as well throughout the years. They've even ran a few love hotels, things like that. But eventually they found their niche, right? Despite the challenges and hurdles. Throughout the video gaming history, they've got a few products that weren't as successful. Nintendo 64, GameCube, Wii U, they were somewhat considered as a commercial failure. But then most recently, Switch, that was I guess a huge success. I brought my Switch here, on my way here, to just use it on the plane. So that's one example of a company being adaptable to the environment or to the situations around it so that it stays relevant and it thrives in the industry. I'm going to give you one more example. Kodak. Does anyone even recognize Kodak anymore? I guess for some of you who are younger, you probably wouldn't. Kodak, once upon a time, and let me backtrace a little bit. Kodak as a company has also been around for 130 years. It was founded 1 year before Nintendo. And it became irrelevant. Why is that? Well, because the film to digital transition. It's a photography company. It was selling films, selling photography gears, selling cameras. And when the industry moved towards digital, it couldn't keep up. It didn't want to adapt because it had a monopoly in the film industry. Why should we bother with digital? Well, there you go. It became irrelevant. So I work at this company called Explore. We're a small startup. We build childcare software or early education software. Every organization goes through, I guess, a journey like this. Might not be exactly the same, but you start off with building a proof of concept. You try to then find the market fit. Then you have venture capital investments, and then you enter a high growth period, which is where we are at. And then hopefully you eventually get to the market domination space. And then even then, you can't just stop, right? There are many, many other startups try to take your place. Now, organizations are made of people. When we say Nintendo, when we say Kodak, they're company identities, right? But who are the people working at that company? And what are they like? How are they going to do things to help the company become or stay relevant? Well, I've got a few things to talk about. The first one is startup versus corporate. Now, in China, there are a lot of gigantic corporations, but there are also thousands, if not tens of thousands or millions of startups, right? Working at a startup versus working at a corporate requires different skill sets and requires different personalities. I'm going to talk about some of them. First of all, being a specialist versus being a generalist. Now, typically at a startup, especially an early stage startup, it requires more generalists, people who can do anything, people who aren't afraid of just, roll up their sleeves and just get things done. Whether you do Ruby, whether you do JavaScript, or at the time CoffeeScript, or you do something else, just to get things done. Whereas at a corporate, because the sheer size of the organization and the resources that it has, it can afford more specialists to actually work on, very deep in tech stack and things like that. So it's just something to think about when you plan out your career, when you ask yourself, well, where would I want to be in like 3 years' time? Think about that. Do you want to work for a multinational corporate, or do you want to work at a startup? Here's a very interesting concept, and something that people don't really think about on a daily basis. Levels of visibility. Well, what does that mean? When you go out for lunch with your colleagues, have you ever complained about things that's happening at work, or perhaps about your other colleagues, or about your manager, about your manager's manager, maybe your CEO? Well, why is that? Because the levels of visibility is different for everyone. This is a pyramid, right? And if you're a software engineer at a large corporation, you're probably somewhere down here, right? Because there are more of us. Just, do the groundwork. We're the builders. We do things, we get things done. And then you go, you climb up the ladder, you've got your managers who might be more people-focused, and then eventually at the top you've got your CEO. But the levels of visibility in terms of the company, in terms of the market, in terms of the product, is actually inversed. At the very top, I would hope your CEO actually knows their stuff, right? Otherwise, your company probably wouldn't survive any longer. And at the bottom, as builders, as doers, we actually have a very narrow tunnel vision because we focus on tasks, we focus on building features, we focus on building products. But companies might have multiple products. They might have other partners. They might have other things to worry about, competitors. So the levels of visibility is very different depending on where you're at a company. So anytime when you just think about, why does that person just did that thing? Or have you asked? Maybe they have some information that you don't. Next concept, levels of tolerance. Now, if you work as, let's say, if you work as a junior developer, right, and you want to progress to a senior developer, what do you have to do? Well, you got to learn more programming concepts. If you're a Ruby developer, you do more Ruby, I guess. One of my favorite interview questions when I was still doing Ruby was I would ask candidates to explain to me Ruby's object model. Just think about it. Ruby's object model, can you actually explain it? Have you heard of eigenclass, aka goat class? What are they? Things like that. Now, anyway, so levels of tolerance, what does that mean? It means that as you progress in your career, you've got more stuff piled on you. More stress, more people to talk to, perhaps people to manage, perhaps more difficult colleagues to talk to, more difficult customers to talk to. Do you actually have the stomach to sustain that? Or would you actually burn out? As I mentioned before, when I was working at Locomotive 7 years ago, I burnt out twice and I suffered depression because To be honest, at the time, I couldn't handle the stress. It was my second leadership role. 7 years later, I still work at the company I work at 2 years ago, Explore. Why is that? Well, because my level of tolerance is now much higher. Now, here's an interesting one. I invented this formula. Truth equals visibility times tolerance. So anytime when you ask your colleague or ask someone, so what's the truth behind this? What actually happened? You got to think about, first of all, the visibility of you and the person you're asking this question to, and your tolerance. Can you handle the truth? What is actually the truth? Just think about that before. I know, as software engineers, we're very analytical. We analyze things, we try to get to the bottom of things. But hey, sometimes there are multiple ways, multiple perspectives to view certain things. Now, we all know this, organization politics, or in other words, office politics. Why does office politics exist, right? Now, there's no doubt that there's a minority of us who would sabotage other people's career for their own, or try to get certain things done. But I believe, human nature is good. The vast majority of us try to do things well, try to do things right. So why do we still have office politics? Well, a lot of it is actually related to the levels of visibility. Depending on where you're at, depending on who you talk to, things might be different. And people might not like what you say. They might not agree with what you say simply because they have different information. So anytime when you try to talk to someone else, try to make your intention right, which I'll talk about in a bit, and try to make it very clear that what you're actually trying to do to avoid having office politics. The next one is about building rapport. Now, this is actually related to office politics. If you don't know what it means, 建立关系. So everything is built on relationships because we're in people business. You can't actually run a company without people, right? Unless you're, I guess, this solo founder, but then you still have to talk to customers, right? So you have to talk to people. How do you actually get customers to buy your products? How do you actually get another department to agree with your approach, to back you up? How do you actually get your manager to back you up? Building the rapport. Maybe go out for a coffee, invite them for lunch, things like that. This is the second part of the talk, and it's the part that's, in my opinion, more interesting because this is about individuals. What can we individually do to make things better, and therefore to make your own career a success? I briefly mentioned intention. So intention versus behavior. It's a known phenomenon that people judge themselves of their own intention and judge others by their behavior. Why is that? Because you can't actually read other people's minds. So their behavior is the only thing that you can grasp, you can judge on. Well, it's actually a very easily solvable problem. Just tell them your intention. Just before you ask them to do something for you or do something with you, tell them your intention. Why do we actually need to do this? I have to do this like all the time when I say to my team that, hey, we need this piece of feature delivered in 2 weeks. They will be like, well, according to our estimation, it's going to take 6 weeks. Well, that's too bad because things need to be done. So and as long as you explain your intention, right, and then people will understand. The next one is recognize your skill gap. I have more gaming-related things a bit later on, but by the way, this is from World of Warcraft, I believe. I just found it on Google. Recognizing your skill gap is very important because without recognizing your skill gap, how would you improve? Now, as software engineers, we know our technical skills and our technical skill gap, hopefully. You can ask your manager, perhaps, the things that you need to work on, Ruby, JavaScript, Rust, whatever it might be, to improve your craft. But as you progress in your career, how do you develop your people skills? Especially for the vast majority of us who are introverts. We hate talking to people. I hate giving a talk in front of hundreds of people, but I still do it because, well, you gotta close your skill gap in order to achieve better things. Unless you're happy where you are today, you're happy with your pay, you're happy with where you are, then you probably don't. But then everyone else will move forward, and then you will become irrelevant. Think like your boss. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you have to read your boss's mind. What it means is that you need to ask two questions. The first question is, do I have the skills to do my manager's job? And the second question is, do I know what skills are needed to do my manager's job? Again, because the levels of visibility, right? You might actually not know what your manager does on a daily basis. Well, you've been sort of focusing on programming Ruby, whereas your manager's like talking to some other people all the time. What the hell are they doing? Well, try to find out. Build a rapport with your manager, find out. Because if you want his or her job, that's what you will be doing on a daily basis. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you don't want your manager's job. You want some other job. Well, find out what skills are needed in order for you to actually get there. Do you actually want to only be a Ruby developer for the rest of your life? Is that where your career is going? If it is, this is the only conference you need to attend. If not, well, maybe look at other avenues as well for knowledge and for information. There's something called Peter principle. Now, it sounds like a very generic term, but what it means is that people in a hierarchy tend to rise to their level of incompetence. As software engineers, because sometimes some of us are so good at what we do, we're excellent developers, we can solve problems just like that. And then what happens? We get promoted to become managers, to manage people. Well, how do we actually do that? Unless you receive proper training, right? How do you actually manage people? You know, when you fix a bug in your code, you can run tests. How do you run tests against people? You can't. Everyone's different. There's no right or wrong. So just remember that. In order for you to progress in your career, especially if you want to get into a position where you start leading teams, think about the people side, think about the soft skills side, and think about the skills that you currently do not have, and think about how do you actually acquire that knowledge. I'll tell you how to have a growth mindset. I recommend you to look it up. Hopefully Baidu will still output correct results, but otherwise try to use a VPN and use Google. What a growth mindset, I'm not going to go down the details. My next slide shows a bunch of different categories of things, kind of comparing growth mindset and fixed mindset. But what it gets down to is that you don't just give up. You always think about how do you improve yourself. If your manager said to you today that, well, you've done a shitty job, instead of saying, well, that's not fair, think about, all right, why does my manager actually say that? What triggers that emotion? And how do I, next time, avoid that trigger and do things better? That's what growth mindset means. So just think about it and just look it up. Now, that's one of my favorite slides because I get to tell a story. And I've got another story coming up as well. So speaking of having a growth mindset, it's over a decade ago now. I'm quite old. When I was doing uni, so I graduated from Monash University in Melbourne. I studied multimedia, which means that I had to do 2D, 3D, video production, sound engineering, a bunch of things, and programming, of course. Halfway through my course, I was like, well, I'm not really learning that much. I think I can do better elsewhere. And as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, at the time I was already freelancing. I had a part-time job doing programming. I was like, is it really time well spent? Perhaps not. So I started asking people around me. I started asking my parents, my relatives, my friends. I was like, well, I don't find a lot of sort of satisfaction and a lot of needs of completing the course. What do you think? And every single one of them told me that, well, you're halfway through. Just finish it. I did finish it, but for a very different reason. I finished it because I thought to myself that this was a hurdle. It was a challenge. I had a challenge of trying to, juggling between different tasks. I was trying to improving my craft by doing actual real-world programming projects instead of spending time doing 2D and 3D. However, you run into challenges and you run into hurdles at work, right? Throughout your career, has it been perfect for everyone? Have you not ever encountered a challenge? Perhaps a bug that took you way longer than you anticipated to solve? When that happens, do you give up or do you try to make things better? So I didn't give up. So my reason for completing my university course was that simply that I didn't want to give up. I believed I can do both, and I did both. I didn't give up my university course, and I didn't give up my freelancing gigs or my part-time job. So I was doing both. And by doing both, obviously, you make sacrifices, right? It means that instead of partying with friends, catching up with friends, you'll be spending your time sort of just doing stuff on your own, completing projects, building freelancing products, things like that. The next concept is called a founder mindset. It doesn't actually mean you have to think like your founder, right? Because not everyone is geared towards being a startup founder. Everyone's different. We've got different personalities. We've got different things that we're good at. So let me tell you another story, what having a founder mindset is. It really boils down to get things done. That's what having a founder mindset is. Now, again, during my university years, as I mentioned before, we had to do 2D, 3D, a bunch of things. One of the projects at the time, and I did my uni over 10, 11, 12 years ago. So at the time, if you still remember, if you were active at the time, you know that Adobe Flash was very popular back then, right? When was the last time you've seen an Adobe Flash project? It's irrelevant. It's a proprietary technology that doesn't actually, well, it did a few things, but then the security holes and everything else that comes with it. So at the time, one of the projects I needed to do, one of the subjects I needed to do was to build out a 2D interactive project in Adobe Flash. And then I thought to myself, well, this is a waste of time. I was already doing PHP at the time. I was actually earning money. I didn't want to spend the time to actually do 2D Flash design. It's just not where my interest is at. Well, what would you do? What would you do? Would you give up your freelancing gig and then just spend maybe 20 hours, 30 hours, 50 hours working on this project so that you can graduate? Or would you just give up and perhaps fail the subject? But then what? You have to do it again. So what I did, and by the way, this happened over a decade ago, right? So I paid an offshore company to do the thing for me. That's what I did. So I went online to one of those like freelancing bidding websites, and I paid an Indian-based offshore company to actually do the Flash project for me. So I can earn money on the side and improve my PHP skills and programming skills to actually pay for that. That's best of both worlds. If I had to do it again, I will. And I believe this is what a founder mindset is. Do whatever it takes to get things done. Don't believe in the status quo just because your teacher says you have to do it. Do you? Would it help your career? Would it help you as a person? If not, then why? Why are you spending your time? How many years can we actually live? Why waste your time on things that don't matter? Focus on just building your skill sets that will help you reach the next level in your career. It's the same thing with your career, with your romantic relationship, whatever it might be. Your friends, it's all the same. Just, work on the most important things. Now, here's a very interesting one, and I'm going to spend a bit of time on this. StarCraft mindset. I also invented this. Has everyone heard of StarCraft? Surely some of you have. StarCraft, 星际争霸, yeah? It actually doesn't matter what the game is. You might have played Age of Empires, you might have played Red Alert, any kind of real-time strategy games. They all work the same way. So this is what a StarCraft 2 game looked like. And for those of you who are not familiar with real-time strategy games, I'll explain. This is your battlefield, so to speak, and this is where the vast majority of your vision is spent. You're just looking at your map, looking at the units that you control, looking at perhaps enemy units, if there are any, and then you control them to fight your enemies. And as junior software engineers, that's what we actually do on a daily basis. We were given a task, and we'll do them. Very narrowly focused on the things just in front of you, right? That's what you do. But as you progress, you need to venture out. You need to broaden your vision. So in StarCraft, this is what we call a mini-map. This is a map that describes the entire battlefield, the entire map, outside of the vision that you can see from the main screen. Why is that important? Well, because it gives you more information. There might be some stuff happening here, there might be enemies somewhere. You gotta know what your colleagues working on, your teammates working on. You gotta know what other departments are doing. I've worked at REA where it was really funny because once a colleague came up to me saying that, well, we started building this data warehouse project for everyone in the company. And I know where the colleague was coming from. She worked at a department somewhere upstairs. And I said to her that, well, have you not talked to the guys downstairs? They were building the exact same project. Well, apparently not. So focus on the minimap as you progress, because it's also important to know what's actually going on around you, right? And this can be very on the micro level as well. In Ruby, when you build a class, do you only think about your own class? Do you not think about how to actually put your class or how to, I guess, make your class more user-friendly so that it works better in your system, so that you don't have to refactor all the time. Or if you do, the refactor will become simpler and easier for everyone else. So always think about things around you. The next bit here, timestamp. Now this is an interesting one. In esports, the esports players, they focus a lot of their attention to the time. Why is that? Well, because down to the minute and down to even the second, things will happen. And when things happen, you gotta know how to deal with it. So that same principle applies to us. Now, I've just given my 5-minute warning, so I'm gonna try to churn through a few slides now. Here's where you control, I guess, have a look at your units, right? The people in your team, their skill sets, their experience, what can they bring to the table, the values that they bring to the team, to the organization, think about that. Think about the team composition. Do you need to talk to other teams? Do you need to talk to other departments, perhaps your customers? And on the right-hand side, we've got those controls. What do we actually need to do? Always think ahead. Think about your actions. Well, do I need to fix this bug? Or do I need to deliver that feature? Or do I need to talk to my product manager to decide? Think about the actions. And then think about the resources at the top right-hand corner. We always will have resource constraints. It doesn't actually matter whether you're working at a multinational corporation or a startup. You have your budget constraints, you have time constraints. Always think about those things. So the next time when you complain, well, we've estimated 6 weeks instead of 2. Well, if you deliver this product in 6 weeks, there will be no product. Maybe there wouldn't even be a company, so think about that. And think about the ways to actually address that as well. And then there's the sort of notification panel to, I guess, always be aware of, I guess this is more of a summary of everything else I just talked about. Always be aware of what's going on. Have you just been attacked? Has your competitor just done something, so then you have to do something different? Or has your manager done something that you have to talk to them about? Things like that. Always be aware of what's going on. Okay, so job versus career. I assume the vast majority of us treat this as our career. We want to build our technical skills, and perhaps one day we can either build more technical skills or build more people skills, right? But what if you want to transition to become, let's say, a product manager or a designer? What do? Don't waste your time. Again, try to find things that will get you to where you want to be. Always ask yourself, where do I want to be in 3 years' time? I should know where I wanted to be even before I graduated uni. I knew I wanted to become a software engineer. I knew I wanted to become better at it, hence why I started contributing to open source projects. If you looked up my GitHub profile, you notice that I've got maybe 100 different projects. I've contributed to quite a few dozens of projects. That's how you get ahead. So always think about that. And then always think about, so what's next? Well, I want to become a CTO, or at the moment, I'm the head of engineering at Explore, leading a team of 20 engineers. Always think about that. Now, these things I'll just quickly churn through, given the time. There's something called DISC profiles. Again, try to look it up. It's a pretty well-known thing. It tests your personality, I guess, at work. So it's kind of like your zodiac sign or whatever it might be, but it's more career-focused. What DISC means is you've got 4 main categories of your personality. It's a scale, but it doesn't actually mean higher is better. It's just different, right? So being decisive, being interactive, stabilizing, and being cautious. 4 different categories. By knowing your own personality work-wise, and by knowing those around you, you can actually figure out better ways to I guess, communicate, to build a rapport with them, which was what I mentioned before. And personalities can actually change. And I'll just spend 30 seconds on this because my time's up. Personalities can change because if you look at the yellow bar versus green bar, the yellow bar, I did it about 2 years ago. The green bar, I did it 6 months ago. Why did my personalities change? Well, because I'm in a different role before. I joined Explore as a tech lead. I was leading one of the projects. I was the architect of the project. So I was very much hands-on. Now I have to manage a team of 20 people, which requires a very different set of skills. Again, I'm going to churn through these slides. Just look up disk profiles if you haven't heard of it and if you're interested in it. And that's it. Thanks.